A video of Rand Paul doing a speech, I believe in 2009, is making its way around the internet today. And in the speech, Paul eviscerates Dick Cheney and basically says he went to Iraq to profiteer.
Even Eisenhower back in the 50s said, beware the military-industrial complex. We need to be fearful of companies that get so big that they could actually be directing policy. When the Iraq War started, Halliburton got $1 billion no-bid contract. Some of the stuff has been so shoddy and so sloppy that our soldiers are over there dying in the shower from electrocution. I mean, it shouldn't be sloppy work, it shouldn't be bad procurement process, but it really shouldn't be baby that these people are so powerful they direct even policy. There's a great YouTube of Dick Cheney in 1995 defending Bush #1, and he goes on for about 5 minutes. He's being interviewed, I think, by the American Enterprise Institute, and he says it would be a disaster, it would be vastly expensive, it would be a civil war, we'd have no exit strategy. He goes on and on for 5 minutes. Dick Cheney says it would be a bad idea, and that's why the first Bush didn't go into Baghdad. Dick Cheney then goes to work for Halliburton, makes hundreds of millions of dollars as their CEO. Next thing you know, he's back in government. It's a good idea to go into Iraq. The day after 9/11, George Tenet's going in the House and Richard Pearl's coming out of the White House. And George Tenet should know more about intelligence than anybody in the world. And the first thing Richard Pearl says to him on the way out is, we've got it, now we can go into Iraq. And George Tenet, who supposedly knows as much intelligence as anybody in the White House, says, well, don't we need to know that they have some connection to 9/11? He says it doesn't matter. It became an excuse. 9/11 became an excuse for a war that they already wanted in Iraq.
Nailed it! Let's see if Paul has a point. Let's listen to Dick Cheney from the early 1990s about why the administration did not topple Saddam during the first Gulf War, when Dick Cheney was in George H.W. Bush's administration, and they decided not to continue.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over, and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
How do you explain that? How do you explain that in the early 1990s, there's a guy who is totally against an Iraq invasion from the United States, okay? And that isn't even the video that Paul is referring to. Paul is referring to a longer one, like a 5-minute speech during a conference where he goes into even more detail about how it is a terrible idea to topple Saddam Hussein because it destabilizes the region, it'll create a civil war, and just all these negative consequences associated with it. And he's right, and he's right. And now, from 2003 and onward, he was totally for it. Okay? Now, people can make the argument, well, it was because of 9/11 and we wanted to make sure that we got the right people and this and that. But there was never any evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved or responsible for 9/11. The idea that he had weapons of mass destruction is also not true, as we figured out eventually. So there has to be a reason why all of a sudden Dick Cheney was in favor of the war in Iraq. And, I mean, the answer, it's hard to escape, man. And I think Paul is right. He's at least partially right, okay? And the idea is, well, look, after that, he went to work for Halliburton, which is affiliated with KBR. And then when he went to work for the Bush administration, all of a sudden, when the war happens, KBR and Halliburton get this tremendous no-bid government contract, and everybody at Halliburton gets rich, and Dick Cheney gets rich. Okay? And look, maybe it's not just that. Maybe it's not just war profiteering, but it's certainly a part of it. And I think that the further ambition might have been that the U.S. government, the neoconservatives, wanted to take control of the Iraqi region in the Middle East because it is a vital region. You can basically have your hand on the spigot of oil, and you can try to control the flow, and you can basically do the bidding for your corporate overlords in the oil business. Remember, George W. Bush is a former oil man, okay? And it gives you a lot of strategic advantages if something happens with Iran. And it's like spreading the empire more and trying to gain more control of the Middle East specifically. And to see a guy argue that strongly against it in the early 1990s, and then by 2003 and onward, all of a sudden it's the best idea ever, and he thought it was fantastic, and he still thinks it's fantastic. Something happened there. One of those things is definitely personal enrichment, and the other thing is just probably a love of imperialism and trying to expand the American empire. But either way you slice it or dice it, here's what's for sure. Rand Paul in that video nailed it.